Everything was running perfectly, until it all fell apart. A composed Black Navy veteran, quietly seated, suddenly finds himself unceremoniously removed from his flight without explanation. But then, in just 6 minutes, he completely flipped the script in a way no one could have imagined. What did he do that brought an entire airline to a grinding halt? Stay tuned, because what comes next will have you rethinking everything. Before we jump into the story, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from today. And if you're intrigued by this tale, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another update. The plane was almost ready to take off. Alexander Drake, a 39-year-old veteran of the United States Navy, had just taken his seat with a quiet assurance shaped by years of discipline and duty. Fresh off a well-deserved vacation, he was looking forward to a peaceful journey home, luxuriating in the comfort of his hard-earned first-class spot. The cabin buzzed with the low hum of conversation and anticipation, and as he settled in, memories of his global military travels mingled with the promise of a smooth flight ahead. Every detail seemed to fall perfectly into place, until an unexpected interruption shattered the calm. Just as a friendly flight attendant began her routine walk down the aisle, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. She stopped at Alexander's seat, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the boarding pass in his hand. There was a brief, charged pause as she shifted her gaze between the ticket and him, as if searching for something amiss. Without preamble, she asked him to move to another seat. Taken aback, Alexander calmly explained, "My ticket clearly indicates that this is my seat in first class," even pointing to the seat number to affirm his claim. Yet, despite his composed demeanor, her tone grew increasingly insistent and dismissive, leaving him, and those watching, puzzled by the sudden escalation. As the scene unfolded, the cabin's once friendly murmur transformed into a backdrop of uneasy whispers and curious stares. Passengers began to sense the tension that crackled in the air, while Alexander, still steadfast in his belief that everything was in order, sought only to resolve the misunderstanding. But every attempt to clarify his situation seemed only to heighten the attendant's agitation, making it clear that this was no ordinary mix-up. The situation teetered on the brink of chaos, setting the stage for what was to come next. Then, as if things weren't escalating enough, a supervisor was called to handle the situation. And that's when it all started to spiral out of control. The entire situation, which had started with a simple misunderstanding, was turning into something much darker. Alexander Drake was utterly taken aback by the unfolding events. Here he was, a 39-year-old Navy veteran who had proudly served his country, suddenly finding himself treated with utter disregard. Despite having fought bravely on distant battlefields and earning every privilege that came his way, he was now being forced off a plane simply because of a clerical error. The sting of humiliation was almost too much to bear, and as he disembarked, he felt an overwhelming sense that this injustice extended far beyond his own misfortune. Standing in the terminal, Alexander's mind raced with questions and bitter disbelief. How could a simple seating mix-up spiral into public degradation? He sensed the curious and sympathetic gazes of fellow passengers, some showing concern, others a deep, pained confusion. It wasn't just a case of being asked to relocate. It was a blatant dismissal of his identity and service. Every fiber of his being protested the unfair treatment, and the more he reflected on it, the more seething anger took hold. This was never just about a seat. It was about a fundamental lack of respect. Despite the valor he had demonstrated in the face of danger, his words and his status as a veteran were conveniently brushed aside. The memory of previous, whispered accounts of similar mistreatment resurfaced in his mind, intensifying his fury and planting seeds of doubt. Was this an act of prejudice? Did his appearance somehow provoke a bias he could neither understand nor accept? As he was led back through the crowded terminal, every step felt like a reminder of his sacrifice and the indignity being forced upon him. Amid the chaos and murmur of discontent from other passengers, A resolute determination began to build inside him. This was no minor error or simple misunderstanding. It was a matter of personal dignity and the principle that no one, especially someone who had given so much for his country, should be treated as if their voice didn't count. Amid his inner turmoil, a quiet resolve took shape. He would not allow this incident to fade into silence. Instead, he vowed that the airline would be held accountable and that his experience would serve as a catalyst for change, ensuring that such mistreatment could never recur. As he stood there waiting for his luggage to be returned to him, a strange calm settled over him. He had been pushed too far, and now he was going to make them pay attention. He wasn't sure what his next move would be, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Alexander Drake didn't have to wait long before the opportunity presented itself. He had been standing near the gate, still in shock, when he noticed one of the airline's customer service representatives walking by. The representative had a clipboard in hand, looking around at the scattered passengers, trying to manage the growing chaos. Without thinking, Alexander Drake stepped forward. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't just walk away quietly. He had to make his voice heard. "Excuse me," Alexander Drake called out, his voice steady but firm. The airline representative's mild annoyance flickered across her face at being interrupted, but the determination in his eyes made her hesitate. "I need to speak to someone about what just happened. I was just kicked off my flight for no reason, and I demand an explanation." Her surprise was palpable as she fumbled with her clipboard, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. Alexander stood resolute, his gaze unyielding as he waited for her response, every second intensifying the charged atmosphere around them. "I've been on flights all over the world, and I've never been treated like this," he continued. "I served my country for years, and now I'm being thrown off a plane like I'm some kind of criminal. You're telling me that this is how your airline treats veterans?" His words sliced through the tense silence, exposing the raw hurt and indignation he felt. The representative shifted uneasily, struggling to maintain eye contact as she mumbled about a misunderstanding and insisted that the staff was merely following protocol. Yet Alexander could see past the weak excuse. This was more than an administrative error. It was a stark reminder of a system that had failed to honor his sacrifices. In that defining moment, he realized that the issue extended far beyond a seating mix-up. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to be heard. The public nature of the humiliation stung deeply, and every whispered comment from nearby passengers only fueled his resolve. He recognized that this was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a broader injustice that many veterans silently endured. With a deep, steadying breath, Alexander resolved that he would not let this injustice fade into the background. Instead, he would make sure that his experience ignited a call for accountability, not just for himself, but for every veteran who had ever felt dismissed or devalued. Without another word, Alexander Drake pulled out his phone and dialed the number for corporate customer service. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't going to just let this go. If the airline wasn't going to listen to him in person, he would take it to the next level. He wasn't asking for an apology. He was demanding accountability. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a person with rights. And if they weren't going to respect those rights, he'd make sure everyone knew about it. It possibly would soar anyway, but he was heading to Boston. As the phone rang, Alexander Drake could feel his heart racing. He was frustrated, angry, and still reeling from what had just happened. But he was determined. He needed to make sure this went beyond just one bad flight. He needed to expose the system that allowed this kind of treatment to happen. When someone finally picked up on the other end, Alexander Drake didn't waste any time. "I was just removed from your flight for no reason. I'm a Navy veteran, and I was treated like I didn't matter," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I want to speak to someone higher up, someone who can actually do something about this." The person on the other end paused, clearly unprepared for the raw intensity in his tone, and offered a quick apology, while requesting more details. Alexander proceeded to lay out the entire ordeal with meticulous clarity. The unexpected mix-up with his seating, the flight attendant's stubborn refusal to consider his evidence, and the degrading way he was unceremoniously escorted off the plane, as if he were nothing more than a disruptive troublemaker. He emphasized that he wasn't merely seeking hollow apologies. He was demanding real accountability. "Look, this isn't just about me," Alexander Drake said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "This is about how your airline treats its passengers, especially veterans. It's about respect, and right now, I'm not feeling any of it." As he spoke, he could almost hear the representative scribbling notes, each mark a silent testament to the gravity of his claims, yet he pressed on, determined that his experience not be dismissed or forgotten. "I demand that this incident be escalated. You need to make sure that the people involved, those flight attendants, the supervisor, understand the gravity of what they've done. They can't just go around treating people like this without consequences." Although the representative promised that someone would follow up with him soon, Alexander's skepticism was evident. He had encountered such empty assurances before. His resolve hardened. This incident was too significant to be swept under the rug. Despite the anger simmering within him, there was an unmistakable calm determination as he ended the call. In that moment, Alexander realized he was no longer just a frustrated passenger. He was a man who had sacrificed for his country and deserved to be treated with dignity. As he stood quietly in the terminal, contemplating his next steps, he recognized that the airline had gravely underestimated his resolve. He possessed not only the experience, but also the courage and the connections to ensure that this injustice would be brought to light. Every detail of the humiliation he had endured reinforced his commitment. He would not let this incident fade into oblivion. Looking around at the dismayed faces of fellow travelers and the indifferent hustle of the terminal, he understood that the true battle was just beginning. Alexander Drake knew that a simple phone call wouldn't suffice to address this systemic failure. He needed to amplify his message far beyond the confines of that one terminal. Recalling the disciplined strategies he'd learned in the Navy, he shifted from reactive frustration to a calculated plan of action. That's when Alexander Drake decided to use the most powerful tool he had, social media. In a matter of minutes, he typed out a detailed post on his Twitter account. He explained everything: how he had been wrongfully kicked off the flight, the disrespect he had faced from the staff, and how, as a veteran, he felt his rights were violated. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he recounted the events, each word building his case and demanding accountability. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a call for action. He wasn't just venting his frustration. He was using his story to make a statement. Alexander Drake didn't just write about his own experience. He urged others to share their stories too. He included the hashtag #RespectVeterans. His post was honest, straightforward, and powerful. He wanted to ensure that people understood this wasn't just one bad encounter. It was part of a larger problem. Within minutes, his tweet was gaining traction. Almost instantly, the online world erupted with activity. Comments began pouring in as people shared their own painful experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. Some of those who responded were fellow veterans, while many were everyday passengers who had encountered similar indignities. The hashtag he introduced rapidly caught fire, spreading across platforms and connecting voices from every corner of the digital landscape. Yet, amid this flurry of support, one reply stood out. A tweet from a well-respected journalist with a massive following. The journalist acknowledged Alexander Drake's experience and pledged to investigate the matter further. That single retweet marked a pivotal moment. It was the spark that ensured his story would ignite and spread like wildfire. The airline could no longer brush this off as a minor isolated mishap. The issue was evolving into a full-blown public relations debacle, with Alexander Drake at its very heart. The more Alexander Drake reflected on the unfolding events, the more he recognized the immense power of social media. In just a few short hours, what had begun as a deeply personal and humiliating incident had transformed into a powerful movement. Individuals from all walks of life began to speak up, revealing their own stories of disrespect and systemic injustice. The airline's own social media channels quickly became inundated with furious comments, not only from those directly affected, but also from people who had never even flown with them before. It was clear that the public was not only concerned about his ordeal, but was also demanding a broader conversation about how veterans, and indeed all individuals, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. His phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications and messages of solidarity. Support poured in from old military comrades, as well as strangers who appreciated his bravery in speaking out. Each message underscored the mounting pressure on the airline to address the situation and take corrective action. No longer could they claim it was merely a simple customer complaint. The incident had ballooned into a significant social media crisis, with Alexander Drake at its epicenter, prepared to push for the next decisive step. As the hours ticked by, his initial posts spread far beyond his expectations. Messages from across the nation began to flood in. Veterans, travelers, and even those who rarely engaged with airline issues rallied behind him. And it wasn't just supportive words. Media outlets started reaching out, eager to feature his account and expose the underlying issues that had led to such blatant mistreatment. What initially appeared to be a one-off incident had evolved into a public outcry. By the time the next morning arrived, the ripple effect of his actions was undeniable, capturing the attention of major news organizations and igniting a broader debate over accountability in customer service. He had become the face of a movement, one that demanded better treatment for veterans, better accountability from airlines, and a reckoning with the way people of color were often treated in spaces where they were supposed to feel safe and respected. He woke up to a news alert on his phone. Overnight, his ordeal had exploded into the headlines. A major national network was broadcasting a breaking news segment, and there, at the forefront, was Alexander Drake's now viral tweet. The headline was stark. Veteran, removed from flight, over seat dispute, sparks national outcry. His image had become ubiquitous, on social media feeds, news sites, and in the hearts of those who believed in justice. What began as a personal grievance had evolved into a searing public reckoning, shining a harsh light on how quickly respect can vanish, leaving veterans and people of color vulnerable to dehumanization. At first, Alexander had simply craved acknowledgement, a way for his experience to be taken seriously. Now, sitting alone in his apartment, amid the constant ping of calls, texts, and emails, he felt the crushing weight of responsibility. His pain had become a shared narrative. Every message of support, every account of similar mistreatment, only intensified his resolve. He was no longer speaking solely for himself. He was speaking for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or degraded by a system that seemed indifferent to their sacrifice. A few hours later, the airline finally reached out. The call came from a representative whose tone betrayed desperation rather than sincerity. They apologized and attempted to minimize the incident, offering a series of compensations, free miles, vouchers, even a complimentary flight, in hopes of quelling the storm. But Alexander Drake was unimpressed by rehearsed apologies and empty gestures. His voice remained unwavering as he demanded, with the clarity and force of someone who had faced far worse, an explanation for the treatment he'd received. He pressed them for specifics. What disciplinary measures would be taken against the staff involved, and what changes would be made to ensure such an incident would never recur. The representative's promise to look into it rang hollow in Alexander's ears. He recognized it as little more than a tactic to delay inevitable accountability. He refused to let the matter be swept aside or forgotten. This was larger than one flawed flight. Determined not to be reduced to a mere footnote in a corporate press release, He resolved to persist until real change was achieved. After the call ended, a turbulent mix of anger and resolve coursed through him. The initial shock had given way to a strategic clarity reminiscent of his Navy days. Realizing that the fight was just beginning, he swiftly transitioned from frustration to action. He began drafting detailed emails to journalists, coordinating potential interviews, and reaching out to veteran advocacy groups that had already expressed solidarity. Every keystroke was a step toward ensuring that his experience and the broader issues it symbolized could not be ignored. This wasn't just about his seat on a plane anymore. It was about exposing a culture of complacency and bias that affected far too many people. The more Alexander Drake thought about it, the clearer it became. He wasn't going to stop until the airline not only took responsibility, but made real, lasting changes. In the hours that followed, every interview and media interaction only deepened his commitment. Sitting down with reporters, he recounted his experience with a mix of controlled passion and unwavering resolve, knowing that each word could spark a broader discussion. His conversations with journalists were both candid and incisive, peeling back layers of a systemic failure that had allowed such mistreatment to occur. Every question he faced was met with a calm yet powerful declaration of his right to dignity. And with each response, it became clear that his story resonated far beyond his own ordeal. As he continued speaking to more media outlets, Alexander noticed his phone lighting up incessantly. Messages from established reporters, supportive notes from strangers, and even calls from influential figures who wanted to understand his perspective. This barrage of attention transformed what had begun as a personal grievance into a nationwide dialogue. The weight of public support fueled his determination, reminding him that he was not alone in his fight. His social media presence exploded, with his carefully crafted posts striking a chord with thousands. And the RespectVeterans hashtag quickly evolved into a rallying cry for change. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just one bad airline incident. It was part of a much bigger issue. Veterans, people of color, and everyday individuals were all chiming in with stories of injustice, discrimination, and being treated as if they didn't matter. Alexander Drake's story had ignited something, a fire that couldn't be put out. It wasn't just the general public reacting anymore. Political leaders, too, began weighing in. Several prominent senators and members of Congress expressed their outrage, with some even calling for hearings on the treatment of veterans and how airlines handle complaints. Alexander Drake couldn't believe the weight of it all. He had started out just wanting to stand up for himself, but now his story was forcing a nationwide conversation about systemic issues within the travel industry. Every day, more people were coming forward, demanding accountability and better treatment for all passengers, especially for those who had served the country. By the end of the week, the pressure on the airline was palpable. It was clear that they were trying to manage the crisis, but every attempt to downplay the situation only seemed to make it worse. Their social media posts apologizing for the incident were being drowned out by a wave of angry comments from the public. The company had initially tried to offer Alexander Drake compensation, a voucher, miles, and a promise of a better experience on another flight was offered, but he had refused. He wasn't interested in free perks. He wanted them to address the core issue, how veterans were often treated, especially when they weren't in uniform. It was clear now that Alexander Drake wasn't backing down, and the more the airline tried to sweep it under the rug, the more the public demanded they take real action. It wasn't long before the airline's CEO issued a public statement. The statement was well crafted, expressing regret over the incident and promising to investigate. But for Alexander Drake, it wasn't enough. He had heard corporate apologies before, and they were often empty. This time, though, he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't just looking for a statement. He wanted change. Real change. Alexander Drake knew that the airline would be forced to do more than issue a half-hearted apology. The public pressure, the political pressure, and the attention from the media had made it clear that they couldn't just offer a few miles and call it a day. Something had to shift. Alexander Drake's fight was gaining momentum. What began as one man standing up for his rights had now grown into something bigger. A fight for respect, accountability, and a rethinking of how people are treated in public spaces. He wasn't about to let it stop here. In the days that followed, Alexander Drake began to see the impact of his actions. Other veterans started reaching out to him, thanking him for raising awareness about the issues they faced. Every day, people who had been afraid to speak up now felt empowered to share their own stories. It was as though Alexander Drake's single act of standing up for himself had triggered a wave of people finally speaking out against the injustices they had endured. The fight for veterans' rights was no longer just a personal battle, it was a movement, and Alexander Drake was at the center of it all. But he wasn't done yet. He knew that he had to keep the pressure on. Alexander Drake wasn't looking for the spotlight. He was looking for change. It was clear that the airline and many other institutions had overlooked a significant issue for far too long. And now, with the whole country watching, Alexander Drake was ready to make sure they couldn't ignore it any longer. The real work was just beginning, and he was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. As the days passed, his resolve only grew stronger. The public outcry, the media coverage, and the massive support he was receiving from veterans and everyday citizens alike kept him focused. Even with all this momentum, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The airline had apologized, and they had issued a public statement, but words were meaningless without action. Alexander Drake wasn't interested in empty promises or token gestures. What he wanted was real change, not just for him, but for every person who had been treated unfairly or discriminated against in public spaces. The spotlight was now on the airline, but Alexander Drake knew it wouldn't last forever. He had to make sure they couldn't just wait out the storm. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, Alexander Drake received an unexpected call. It was from a high-level representative from the airline's legal department. The representative introduced themselves and immediately launched into an apology, one that Alexander Drake had heard 1,000 times before, but this time the tone was more serious. "Mr. Drake, we've reviewed the situation thoroughly and we take full responsibility for the incident. However, we would like to discuss how we can resolve this matter privately," the representative said. Alexander Drake wasn't sure what they meant by resolving this privately, but he had an idea. They were probably trying to offer him some kind of compensation again. Miles, free flights, maybe even a public apology. But Alexander Drake was done with that. He wasn't interested in a quick fix. He had made it clear from the start that he wasn't looking for a free ride or an empty apology. He wanted more. "I'm not interested in compensation or free flights," Alexander Drake replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm interested in real change. If you want to resolve this, I want a meeting with someone at the highest level. Someone who can guarantee that this kind of thing won't happen again." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as if the representative wasn't sure how to respond. "I understand, Mr. Drake. Let me see what I can do," they said, before hanging up. Alexander Drake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had just taken a significant step. It wasn't enough to let them throw money at the situation or offer him a token gesture. He needed them to understand the gravity of the issue. He wasn't just going to let them sweep this under the rug, and now they were realizing that they had to face the consequences. In the days that followed, everything became a blur. Alexander Drake spent most of his time speaking with veteran advocacy groups, organizing meetings, and strategizing his next move. He began to make connections with people in higher circles. Some were former military officers, others were civil rights activists, but they all shared one thing in common. They were all ready to stand with Alexander Drake and help push for the changes that were desperately needed. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a rallying cry for people who had been marginalized, mistreated, or silenced. Now, together, they were going to make sure the airline and every other corporation heard them loud and clear. At the same time, the media continued to cover the story. But now the coverage was no longer just about Alexander Drake's experience on the plane. It had become about how this incident had exposed deeper issues within the airline industry. And beyond, articles were being written about how veterans, especially veterans of color, were often treated unfairly by corporations. Public figures began to speak out, calling for a change in policies not just at the airline but across the entire travel industry. The spotlight was no longer just on Alexander Drake. It was on an entire system that had been allowed to perpetuate discrimination and mistreatment without consequence. Then the call came. The airline had agreed to a face-to-face meeting with the CEO. Alexander Drake was going to sit down with the top decision-maker of one of the largest airlines in the world. He could hardly believe it. This was the moment he had been working toward. It wasn't just a chance to have his voice heard. It was a chance to make a real, lasting impact. If he could get the airline to commit to real change, it would set a precedent for other companies to follow. This was his opportunity to force their hand, to make sure they understood that this wasn't just about one bad flight. It was about changing the way people, especially veterans and people of color, were treated across the board. As he prepared for the meeting, Alexander Drake couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Just a few weeks ago, he had been a regular passenger on a flight, quietly enjoying his trip. Now he was sitting on the precipice of something much bigger. A movement that could change the way people thought about respect, fairness, and accountability. It had all started with one simple act of standing up for himself. But now it was a fight for something much larger. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. The airline wasn't going to just roll over. But Alexander Drake was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had experienced. The day of the meeting arrived, and Alexander Drake felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that he couldn't shake. He had spoken with many people in the days leading up to it, from veterans organizations to journalists, even political figures who had joined his cause. Now, all of that was leading to this one crucial moment. The CEO of the airline had agreed to meet with him, and Alexander Drake knew this was his opportunity to press for the kind of real change he had been fighting for. As Alexander Drake walked into the airline's corporate headquarters, a tall, modern building that screamed business as usual, he couldn't help but feel a sense of surrealism. A few weeks ago, he had been just another passenger, one among many, quietly sitting in his seat. Now he was stepping into the heart of one of the world's largest airlines, ready to challenge them at their highest level. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The room where he was to meet the CEO was sleek and impersonal, with glass walls, polished floors, and minimalistic furniture. There was no warmth in the space, just a cold corporate professionalism that seemed to reflect everything wrong with the airline industry. A few minutes passed before the CEO entered the room. A middle-aged man in a dark suit with a confident, detached demeanor. He greeted Alexander Drake with a firm handshake, but didn't waste time with pleasantry. The tension in the room was palpable. "Mr. Williams," the CEO began, settling into the chair across from Alexander Drake. "I understand you've made quite a public issue out of an incident that occurred on one of our flights. We've reviewed the details, and we are here to discuss how we can resolve this matter," the CEO continued. Alexander Drake remained calm, but inside his heart was pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when everything he'd worked for could either succeed or fail. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he spoke. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, but let's be clear. I'm not here for compensation or an empty apology. This isn't about me, and it never was. It's about something much bigger: how veterans, especially Black veterans, are treated. It's about respect, the kind of respect that I and others like me have earned and deserve." The CEO, looking a bit taken aback by the bluntness of Alexander Drake's words, adjusted in his seat. "We're sorry that you felt disrespected, Mr. Williams. We've already taken action internally. The employees involved have been disciplined, and we're reviewing our training protocols to make sure this doesn't happen again." Alexander Drake's eyes narrowed. He had heard that line before, action behind closed doors, but he wasn't convinced it would amount to anything substantial. He knew that if they wanted to move past this, they had to do more than just talk. They had to show the public that they were serious about changing how they treated passengers, particularly veterans. "I don't want your corporate jargon," Alexander Drake said, his voice firm. "I want transparency. I want you to prove that you're not just paying lip service to this, that you're not just sweeping it under the rug. If the treatment of veterans and people of color is going to change, then it starts with you, right here, right now." There was a long silence as the CEO shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not used to being confronted so directly. Alexander Drake could tell that he was weighing his options, perhaps considering how best to manage the public relations nightmare. This meeting wasn't just about Alexander Drake. It was about making sure that the airline understood they couldn't continue to operate as they always had. The world was watching now, and Alexander Drake wasn't going to let them pretend this issue didn't exist. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the CEO spoke again. But this time, his tone was different, less defensive, more measured. "You're right, Mr. Williams. We've made mistakes, and we can't fix those mistakes by just issuing statements or internal memos. If we want to regain the trust of passengers, we need to do more. We need to show the world that we understand the gravity of the situation." Alexander Drake nodded, not fully convinced, but at least hearing something that resembled accountability. The conversation shifted as the CEO began to outline the airline's plan to address the situation. New training programs, a review of their hiring practices, and a commitment to diversity and inclusion in a way that would go beyond surface-level changes. But Alexander Drake wasn't letting them off the hook just yet. "This is a start," he said slowly, "but it's not enough. I need you to take action that goes beyond internal memos and vague promises. I want to see you publicly commit to real change. I want to see this issue addressed in your marketing, in your employee training, and in your public communications. And it can't just be a one-time thing. This needs to be part of your company's DNA moving forward." The CEO paused, clearly uncomfortable with the level of scrutiny Alexander Drake was putting on him. But Alexander Drake knew that was the point. The more uncomfortable he made them feel, the more they'd be pushed into making a meaningful commitment. Alexander Drake had been pushed to the edge on that flight, and now he was pushing the airline right back. After a tense pause, the CEO finally nodded. "You're right. We can do better, and we will. I will personally oversee a committee that will work on these changes, and we will make them public. I'll also ensure that we partner with veteran organizations to make sure our actions match our words." Alexander Drake could feel the smallest flicker of satisfaction in that moment. This wasn't the victory he had imagined when he first boarded that flight, but it was a victory nonetheless. The airline was listening now, and they were starting to realize that their actions and their inaction had consequences. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about holding institutions accountable for the way they treated people. As Alexander Drake stood to leave the meeting, he knew it wasn't over. The airline might have agreed to take action, but this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Alexander Drake wasn't going to stop until he saw those changes in motion, until he saw a system that truly respected veterans, people of color, and every passenger who stepped foot on their planes. For now, though, he had made a dent. He had forced the airline to confront the issues they had long ignored, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, Alexander Drake felt like he was on the path to real change. This was just the first battle in a much bigger war. In the days that followed the meeting with the CEO, Alexander Drake could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders grow heavier. The words exchanged in that sleek corporate boardroom, while significant, were only the first step in a much longer journey. The airline's commitment to do better, and implement changes sounded promising. But Alexander Drake knew better than to trust words alone. He had seen too many companies issue public apologies, only to revert to business as usual once the cameras were off. This time, Alexander Drake wasn't going to let that happen. The very next morning, he put his thoughts into action. He called the media, making sure that the story continued to stay in the public eye. He spoke to reporters who had been covering the incident, sharing the details of the meeting with the CEO, and emphasizing that the fight was far from over. He made it clear that this wasn't about one bad incident. It was about a systemic issue that had been ignored for far too long. Alexander Drake wasn't just the voice of one man. He was the voice of a community that had been overlooked, mistreated, and disrespected for years. But it wasn't just the media that Alexander Drake turned to. He knew that he needed to keep the pressure on the airline, and the best way to do that was by staying organized and relentless. He began to work with veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and other activists to build a coalition that could hold the airline accountable. Together, they drafted a petition that called for concrete actions, actors that went beyond the CEO's vague promises. They demanded that the airline create an independent oversight committee to monitor how they handled complaints related to discrimination and unfair treatment. They also called for public transparency, asking for quarterly reports detailing the progress of the changes the airline promised to implement. But perhaps most importantly, they demanded that the airline make a formal apology to Alexander Drake and to all veterans who had been wronged. A gesture that went beyond a private conversation or a social media post. Alexander Drake didn't stop there. He knew that corporate promises could be easily forgotten without the right kind of pressure. He reached out to lawmakers who had spoken out in his support, encouraging them to take the matter up in public hearings. The issue wasn't just about one airline's mistakes. It was about how the entire industry treated veterans and marginalized groups. His push for a congressional hearing aimed to bring attention to the broader cultural problems within the airline industry. He wasn't looking to single out one airline. He was looking to change the whole system. If the airline industry could be forced to reckon with the way it treated its most vulnerable passengers, perhaps that would have a ripple effect across other industries as well. Alexander Drake also took the time to personally engage with his growing network of supporters. He spent hours on the phone responding to messages from veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been following his story. His inbox was flooded with personal stories of discrimination and mistreatment, each one a reminder that his fight was bigger than himself. As he read through the messages, Alexander Drake realized just how much of a difference he had already made. People who had felt powerless for years were now emboldened to speak out. What had started as a fight to correct one injustice was now a movement to hold institutions accountable for their treatment of veterans, minorities, and every passenger who had been treated as less than human. Despite all the momentum, Alexander Drake couldn't help but feel the weight of the challenge ahead. The airline, though publicly committed to change, was not going to roll over easily. He had already seen their tactics. They had tried to smooth things over with compensation offers, with corporate statements, and with vague promises, but the public scrutiny wasn't going away, and neither was he. He was pushing harder, and every step he took was met with resistance. The airline's legal department began to push back, trying to slow down the petition, questioning the demands for oversight and offering counter-proposals. They even suggested that Alexander Drake and his coalition were making unreasonable demands, trying to paint them as people who just wanted to keep the issue alive for personal gain. But Alexander Drake wasn't deterred. If anything, the more the airline fought back, the more determined he became. He knew that if they were pushing back this hard, it meant they were feeling the pressure, and that was exactly what he wanted. The louder his voice grew, the more attention the issue received, and the more it became impossible for the airline or any other corporation to ignore it. In the midst of this, Alexander Drake began to notice something that fueled his drive even further. The public was starting to pick sides. The hashtag #RespectVeterans had exploded on social media. And it wasn't just veterans using it anymore. Ordinary citizens were rallying behind him, expressing solidarity with the cause. People were sharing their own stories of being mistreated, and the online movement was growing by the day. Some companies began to take notice and reached out to Alexander Drake with offers of support, expressing interest in backing his call for systemic change. This was no longer just about one airline. It was about a broader movement to hold institutions accountable for their actions and to give a voice to those who had long been ignored. Meanwhile, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, the airline began to issue more public statements. They highlighted their ongoing review of procedures and promised to enhance the customer experience going forward. But their words didn't carry the same weight they once did. People weren't fooled by vague corporate speak anymore. They wanted results, not promises. Alexander Drake knew that this battle was far from over. He had made a dent, but there was still much work to be done. The pressure on the airline was mounting, but he also knew that true, lasting change wasn't going to come overnight. He had to stay focused, stay organized, and keep pushing forward. This wasn't just about his own experience. It was about the hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people who had been silenced for too long. Alexander Drake was determined to be the voice they needed, the catalyst for the change that was so desperately overdue. As he sat at his desk, sifting through more messages and petitions, Alexander Drake looked at the road ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time it felt like he was actually making a difference. He wasn't just a man standing up for his rights anymore. He was leading a movement, one that could change the way people were treated in the public eye. And he wasn't going to stop until that change was made real. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind for Alexander Drake. He had ignited a spark, and now it was spreading faster than he could have ever anticipated. The pressure on the airline was growing, and their public relations team seemed to be scrambling to maintain control. But Alexander Drake wasn't slowing down. If anything, the momentum behind his movement was only intensifying every day. New developments, new media coverage, new supporters, and new challenges arose. Yet through it all, Alexander Drake stayed focused on one thing: real change. He knew that this wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. It was about creating lasting, systemic change within an entire industry. And he wasn't going to stop until that change was a reality. Alexander Drake's phone buzzed incessantly. Some days it felt overwhelming with the constant stream of calls, messages, and emails. But he didn't let it distract him. He knew the fight ahead was bigger than any one person. The support he was receiving from veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and even everyday people who had been following his story online was overwhelming. People were reaching out from all corners of the country, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment. And they wanted to join the cause to make sure their voices were heard as well. Alexander Drake's personal story had become a symbol of something much larger. It had become a rallying cry for those who had long been ignored by institutions, for those who had been subjected to unfair treatment because of their race, their gender, or their status as veterans. As the movement grew, so did the pressure on the airline. Alexander Drake was relentless in his pursuit of accountability. He didn't just want promises, he wanted measurable actions. The petition he and his coalition had started had gained thousands of signatures. It was no longer just a document of support. It was a clear demand for change. And people weren't just signing their names. They were sharing it with their friends, their families, their social circles. The more people learned about what had happened to Alexander Drake, the more they became invested in the cause. Alexander Drake didn't shy away from the spotlight. He understood the importance of keeping the issue in front of the public. The media continued to cover the story, and he used every interview, every opportunity, to push for concrete changes. One of his main points was that the airline needed to do more than just change their training programs. They needed to be held accountable by a third party. The internal review process was no longer enough. It needed to be independent, transparent, and open to public scrutiny. Although Alexander Drake's demand for external oversight was met with resistance, he knew it was necessary. If the airline was serious about change, they needed to prove it, not just say it. As the calls for accountability grew louder, the airline began to shift its approach. They started making more public gestures, statements from top executives, and a greater focus on diversity and inclusion in their marketing materials. And even an apology video from the CEO was released. But for Alexander Drake, these were just attempts to save face. He wasn't buying it, he needed to see action. The CEO's apology, though heartfelt, felt hollow to him. Alexander Drake knew that words were easy to say. What mattered was what happened next. Alexander Drake began to ramp up his efforts. He organized town hall meetings, inviting people from all walks of life to speak about their own experiences with discrimination and mistreatment. These meetings, which were streamed online, attracted hundreds of viewers, veterans, people of color, parents, and regular citizens, all sharing stories of how they had been wronged by corporations, the government, or society in general. The town halls were emotional, raw, and incredibly powerful. They provided a platform where people could speak up, share their experiences without fear of retribution. Alexander Drake listened attentively to every story, knowing that each one added weight to his cause. The most surprising part of the town halls was the number of people who reached out to him privately after the sessions. Many shared personal stories of racial bias, unfair treatment, and discrimination. Stories that for many were too painful to share publicly. Alexander Drake realized that the movement he had started wasn't just about fighting for his own rights. It was about creating a space where others could safely share their own stories and demand justice. The more he learned about what people were going through, the more determined he became to fight not just for veterans, but for everyone who had been treated unjustly. Meanwhile, the airline was starting to feel the pressure from all sides. Politicians were getting involved, and some were even calling for a congressional investigation into the airline's practices. The public outcry was undeniable, and it was clear that the airline couldn't just keep offering half-hearted apologies and PR stunts. They had to make real changes. As Alexander Drake continued to lead the charge, the airline's legal team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout. They were trying to play the long game, hoping that if they waited out the storm, things would eventually calm down. But Alexander Drake wasn't about to let that happen. He knew that if they were allowed to get away with the bare minimum, this whole ordeal would have been for nothing. One afternoon, as Alexander Drake was preparing for another media appearance, he received a call from an unexpected source, the airline's chief diversity officer. She had been following the story closely and wanted to meet with him to discuss the next steps. The fact that they were reaching out to him directly was a sign that the pressure was starting to take its toll. She told him that the airline had realized they needed to do more than just make superficial changes. They needed to engage in a real dialogue with the communities they served. Alexander Drake agreed to meet, but he wasn't ready to let them off the hook. When they sat down together, he made it clear that any discussion about moving forward had to be rooted in transparency. He insisted that the airline work with independent, third-party auditors to oversee the implementation of their diversity and inclusion initiatives, and that they publicly commit to publishing quarterly progress reports. Alexander Drake wasn't going to let the airline slide by with vague promises or internal reviews. He knew that if the airline was serious about changing, they needed to be held accountable, not just by their internal teams, but by the people they served. As the conversation unfolded, Alexander Drake saw something in the chief diversity officer's eyes. A recognition that this wasn't just about a PR disaster for the airline, but about doing what was right. She agreed to many of his demands and promised that the airline would begin working with external auditors to ensure that their diversity programs were more than just window dressing. Alexander Drake knew this wasn't a complete victory yet, but it was progress. That night, Alexander Drake sat down to write an update for his supporters. The fight was far from over, but he was finally beginning to see the kind of change he had been pushing for. The airline had made commitments, but now it was time to hold them accountable. His heart was full, and his resolve was even stronger. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the verge of something real. He wasn't just changing one airline. He was changing the way the entire industry thought about respect and equality and accountability. And that, Alexander Drake knew, was only the beginning. The weeks following the meeting with the Chief Diversity Officer were a pivotal time for Alexander Drake. As much as he wanted to feel the satisfaction of a small victory, he knew the hard work was far from over. The airline had made public commitments to improve, but Alexander Drake had seen enough corporate promises to know that, without consistent pressure, those commitments could easily slip away. Now, it was time to hold them accountable and to ensure that they followed through on their promises. Not just for Alexander Drake, but for everyone who had been affected by similar mistreatment. Alexander Drake had become a symbol of accountability, but he also understood that one voice, no matter how loud, wasn't enough to change an entire system. He needed to keep the momentum going, and he needed a platform that would ensure the issue remained in the public eye. He turned to the one thing that had gotten him this far: the power of grassroots organizing and social media. The hashtag #RespectVeterans had become more than just a call to action. It had turned into a movement. People were sharing their stories, offering their support, and demanding change. The airline was under a microscope, and it wasn't just Alexander Drake who was watching. The public was too. As Alexander Drake continued to advocate for real, lasting change, he decided to take the next step. He and his team of supporters started organizing a rally in Washington, D.C., aimed at both raising awareness and pressuring lawmakers to take action. The rally was going to be a huge undertaking, but Alexander Drake believed it was necessary. It wasn't enough for the airline to make changes in isolation. This was about a larger issue that required systemic reform. The event would focus on a few key issues: fair treatment of veterans, racial equity, and corporate accountability in the airline industry. Alexander Drake knew that these issues couldn't be solved in isolation. They needed to be addressed as part of a broader conversation on social justice. Alexander Drake and his team worked tirelessly for weeks to organize the rally. They reached out to veteran organizations, civil rights groups, labor unions, and anyone who had a stake in fighting for equality and accountability. The response was overwhelming. People were eager to come together to make their voices heard and to stand in solidarity with Alexander Drake's fight. Veterans from all over the country pledged to attend, as did countless others who had been inspired by his story. The rally was shaping up to be much more than just a protest. It was becoming a statement that the fight for justice was a fight that united people from all walks of life. As the date for the rally drew closer, the airline began to feel the pressure. Their PR teams had been busy releasing more statements and holding internal meetings to discuss the best way to manage the situation. But Alexander Drake was no longer interested in their words. The time for empty apologies was long past. He had pushed the airline to make commitments, but now it was time to push them to take action. The rally would be a critical part of that effort. Alexander Drake's platform had only grown stronger, and he had the public's support on his side. He knew that if they could turn the rally into a massive show of force, it would be impossible for the airline to ignore the demands for real change. In the meantime, Alexander Drake kept up his media appearances. Speaking on TV, radio, and podcasts, he talked about the importance of holding corporations accountable, about the systemic racism that so often went unchecked in industries like aviation, and about how the treatment of veterans was often overlooked. The media attention had skyrocketed since his initial social media post, and every appearance was another opportunity to bring the issue to a broader audience. The more Alexander Drake spoke, the more people were listening. Not just to him, but to the message he was carrying. It wasn't just about one airline or one person's bad experience. It was about systemic inequality and the need for accountability in every institution that held power over people's lives became undeniable. At the same time, the airline began to realize just how serious Alexander Drake's movement had become. They had already committed to making changes, but now they were under intense scrutiny. The rally in Washington wasn't just going to be a local event. It was going to be broadcast across the country, and perhaps even internationally. Alexander Drake had successfully turned what had started as a personal fight into a nationwide cause, and the airline knew it couldn't afford to let the situation get any worse. Behind the scenes, there were talks of more concrete changes, but his team was making sure that those changes were visible, real, and publicly documented. As the day of the rally approached, Alexander Drake found himself feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. He had spent so much time speaking about change, fighting for it, and pushing for it. But now the moment of truth was finally here. Would the rally make a real impact? Would it shift the public conversation in a way that forced the airline and other corporations to take accountability for their action? Alexander Drake knew it was a huge risk, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He had been pushed around and disrespected for too long, and now he was ready to lead the charge for change. The night before the rally, Alexander Drake sat in his hotel room and reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. He thought about the moment he had been kicked off that flight, how he had felt humiliated and powerless. He thought about the countless people who had come forward to share their own stories of mistreatment. And he thought about the changes he had already begun to see. The airline's public commitments, the increased awareness of veterans' rights, and the way the public was starting to hold corporations accountable. This rally wasn't just the culmination of his efforts. It was the next step in a much larger fight for justice and equality. In the morning of the rally, Alexander Drake stood at the front of the crowd in Washington, D.C., looking out at the sea of people gathered on the National Mall. The energy was electric. Thousands of people, all united by a common cause, standing together for what was right. There were veterans in uniform, civil rights activists, families holding signs that read, "Respect Veterans," and accountability for all. The moment was surreal. Alexander Drake had gone from being an ordinary man caught up in an unfair situation to leading a movement that had captured the nation's attention. The rally was a massive success, with speeches from veterans, lawmakers, and prominent activists. He spoke passionately about the importance of holding corporations accountable, about how the airline's treatment of him was just a reflection of larger societal issues, and about how this moment could spark a wider conversation about respect and fairness. The rally had far-reaching media coverage, and by the time it was over, Alexander Drake had made it clear that this wasn't the end. The airline had to deliver on its promises, and if it didn't, the public would continue to hold them accountable. In the days that followed, the airline's leadership began to make good on their commitments. They announced a partnership with veteran organizations to ensure that their policies regarding the treatment of veterans were not just theoretical, but actively enforced. They established an independent oversight committee to track the progress of their diversity initiatives, and they made a public commitment to transparency, pledging to release quarterly reports on the steps they were taking to ensure fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or background. It was a hard-fought victory, Alexander Drake knew that. But it was a victory nonetheless. The airline had changed, and so had the industry. Alexander Drake had become more than just a figurehead for his own fight. He had become the face of a movement that had shifted the conversation about equality, respect, and accountability. Months passed, and the reverberations of the rally and the ensuing changes in the airline industry continued to unfold. The attention Alexander Drake's story had garnered was no longer just a headline or a viral moment. It had sparked a transformation in how large institutions would be held accountable. What had started as a fight for his own dignity had turned into a nationwide call for justice that reached far beyond the airline industry. And while Alexander Drake could have easily walked away, basking in the success of the changes he had helped bring about, he knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than himself. Despite the intense pressure they had faced, the airline began implementing the reforms they had promised. The independent oversight committee that Alexander Drake had fought for was up and running, with regular reports being published that tracked the airline's progress on diversity and inclusion. New mandatory training programs for staff were rolled out, focusing on how to handle conflicts, ensure fairness, and respect passengers from all walks of life. They also started actively partnering with veteran organizations to ensure that military veterans were treated with the respect they deserved, not just in their advertising but in every aspect of the customer experience. Alexander Drake had pushed for accountability, and for the first time the airline was being forced to act on its words. But he didn't stop there. He began to turn his attention to the broader fight. The success with the airline was just one victory in what he saw as a much larger battle, one that would span industries, and aimed to address systemic inequalities that went far beyond the airline industry. Alexander Drake became a voice for veterans, for marginalized communities, and for those who had been silenced by the powerful systems that shaped their lives. He knew that if he stopped now, the changes he had helped create could be undone just as quickly as they had been won. There was still so much work to be done. In the months that followed, Alexander Drake traveled across the country, meeting with veteran groups, civil rights organizations, and lawmakers who were eager to hear his story. His voice became a rallying cry for reform, for fairness, and for the kind of systemic change that would ensure that what had happened to him on that flight would never happen to anyone else again. He was invited to speak at conferences, appeared on television and in podcasts, and even testified before Congress, advocating for veterans' rights, greater transparency in the corporate world, and stronger protections against discrimination. Alexander Drake wasn't just a voice for the voiceless. He was becoming a leader in a movement that aimed to break down the barriers of inequality that had held too many people back for too long. But despite all the success, there were challenges that he faced, some of them unexpected. While the airline had made strides in implementing their diversity initiatives, there were still voices that resisted these changes. Some argued that the reforms were unnecessary, that the airline was just caving to public pressure. Alexander Drake had anticipated this kind of pushback, but it still stung. The reality was, change was hard, and it would take more than just one success story to convince everyone that real reform was necessary. Yet, Alexander Drake remained undeterred. He knew that change often came slowly, and that the most difficult fights were the ones that mattered the most. He was prepared to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles in his way. One of the most powerful moments in his journey came when he received a letter from the flight attendant who had initially removed him from the plane. She had followed the story and, over time, had come to realize the gravity of what had happened. In her letter, she expressed her regret for how she had treated Alexander Drake and acknowledged the systemic issues that had contributed to the incident. She apologized, and while the apology was far from easy for him to accept, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability, not just from corporations, but from individuals who had been complicit in upholding systems of injustice. This letter, though it didn't undo the pain Alexander Drake had felt, became a turning point for him. He realized that even the smallest acts of accountability, whether from a company, a person, or a community, could have a lasting impact. The apology, he realized, was a recognition that people could change, that they could learn from their mistakes, and that change didn't always have to come from the top down. It could come from the bottom up, from the collective push of people working together to create a fairer, more just world. Alexander Drake continued to work with the airline, not only as a critic but as a partner in helping them develop the kind of long-term strategies that would help ensure the positive changes continued. He met with their leadership regularly, sitting down with the diversity and inclusion teams and helping them to understand the real-world impact of their policies. He didn't just want the airline to do the right thing. He wanted them to do it because they understood why it mattered, because they realized that true change required understanding and empathy, not just statistics or press releases. One of the most rewarding outcomes of his fight was the ripple effect it created. Other industries started taking note of the changes in the airline. There were calls for increased diversity and inclusion within other sectors of transportation, in hotels, and in large retail corporations. Businesses that had previously operated with little oversight now found themselves under scrutiny, being held to a higher standard of fairness and transparency. Alexander Drake's story had become a blueprint for holding corporations accountable, not through force, but through collective action and the power of a community that refused to stay silent. But even as the movement gained traction, Alexander Drake remained grounded. He never lost sight of the personal fight that had started it all. The feeling of being humiliated and powerless, the anger at being dismissed because of who he was. That feeling was still a part of him, but it was no longer the focus. Now, he was working not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered silently, for all the passengers who had been ignored. The fight had become bigger than any one person, and Alexander Drake had become a leader in a movement that would outlast him. In the end, Alexander Drake had done more than change an airline's policies. He had changed the way people thought about fairness, accountability, and respect. He had forced a giant to confront its failures, and in doing so, had helped push an entire industry toward a future where everyone could be treated with dignity and respect. It was a hard-fought victory, one that took every ounce of courage he had. But Alexander Drake knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And as he looked toward the future, he knew the fight for justice, respect, and equality would continue. One step, one story, and one victory at a time. This story teaches us that standing up for our rights and refusing to be silenced can lead to significant change, even in the face of injustice and discrimination. It reminds us that every person deserves respect and fair treatment, regardless of their background, occupation, or appearance. When we witness or experience mistreatment, especially from powerful institutions, it is important to speak out and hold them accountable. The experience of Alexander Drake, a veteran who was unjustly removed from his flight, shows that calm persistence and determined advocacy can transform a personal struggle into a broader movement for social justice. His unwavering resolve to demand transparency and meaningful reforms not only challenged the airline's policies, but also inspired others to come together and fight for equality. Ultimately, this story demonstrates that change is possible when individuals refuse to accept disrespect, and it highlights the power of grassroots activism combined with media engagement. By leveraging social media and community support, we can collectively push for systemic change and create a more inclusive society that truly values every person's contributions and rights. Undoubtedly, if this video struck a chord with you, hit that like button and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we'll build a community that loves sharing meaningful stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next exclusive drop. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.